What if I told you that the emotional distance you're feeling right now is not random, and it's not just happening to them, it's happening because of the space between you two? And here's the part most people miss. Your soulmate isn't just going through something internally. They may actually be emotionally reacting to the relationship itself, in ways neither of you fully realizes yet. You notice it first in the silence, the shorter replies, the delayed responses, the emotional flatness where warmth used to be, and your mind starts filling in the gaps. Did I do something? Are they losing interest? Is this the beginning of the end? But emotionally charged relationships don't usually break in obvious moments. They shift in subtle emotional weather changes where one person becomes overwhelmed and the other becomes confused. And confusion is where anxiety starts writing stories that may not be true. Emotional storms in relationships often begin with subtle withdrawal rather than obvious conflict, and this can make them easy to misread. One partner may start responding less, becoming quieter or emotionally less available, and from the outside it can look like indifference or fading interest. In reality, this pattern is often the nervous system attempting to regulate overwhelm. When someone is emotionally flooded by stress, unresolved internal conflict, or even relational tension, they may not have the capacity to process interaction in real time, so instead of engaging, they reduce input. This is not always a conscious decision. It is often an automatic protective response where the mind tries to create distance in order to regain internal stability. Silence, delayed replies, or emotional flatness can therefore function as a form of self-soothing rather than rejection. The difficulty is that relationships are bidirectional systems, so one person's withdrawal does not remain neutral in its effect. The other partner often experiences that same distance as uncertainty or loss, which activates anxiety and increases attentional focus on the change. The mind begins scanning for meaning in small details, tone shifts, timing differences, reduced warmth, and starts constructing explanations. Because humans dislike ambiguity, the brain prefers a coherent story, even if it is not accurate. This is where misinterpretation grows. What is actually emotional overload in one person can be perceived as emotional disengagement by the other. At a deeper level, this dynamic is intensified in emotionally significant bonds because closeness amplifies sensitivity. The more invested someone is, the more noticeable even small shifts feel. This creates a feedback loop where withdrawal leads to anxiety, anxiety leads to pursuit or questioning, and pursuit leads to further withdrawal. Neither person is intentionally harming the connection, but both are responding to internal states rather than the shared reality of the relationship. Over time, this can create a cycle that feels like emotional instability when it is actually two different coping mechanisms colliding under stress, shaped more by internal regulation limits than by the actual level of care between the individuals involved. When emotional distress is intense, many people don't communicate it directly, not because they are trying to be misleading, but because they may not have clarity themselves about what they are feeling. Emotional overwhelm can reduce access to language, reflection, and even basic emotional labeling. In that state, the mind shifts into survival-oriented responses, and communication often becomes indirect. Instead of saying, "I'm hurt," "I'm overwhelmed," or "I need space," a person may express it through behavior, withdrawal, irritability, inconsistency, or silence. These are not always intentional signals meant to confuse the other person. They are often the only available outlets when emotional processing capacity is reduced. This is especially common in relationships where emotional intensity is high because closeness can activate unresolved internal patterns. When feelings become too large to organize internally, the nervous system prioritizes stabilization over expression, so rather than explaining the storm, the person steps out of interaction with it. To them, this withdrawal may feel like the safest way to prevent escalation or further emotional overload. However, because there is no verbal explanation attached to the behavior, the other person is left interpreting absence without context. That interpretation gap is where misalignment begins. The partner who is not overwhelmed will naturally look for meaning in the change. They may assume detachment, loss of interest, or emotional distance in the relational sense, when in reality, the behavior is rooted in internal regulation struggles rather than relational evaluation. Emotional acting out replaces emotional articulation, and this shift can make patterns seem confusing or inconsistent. Another layer is that indirect communication often carries unconscious emotional leakage. Even when words are absent, tone, timing, and presence change in ways that signal distress. The receiving partner senses something is different but cannot locate what it is, which increases internal uncertainty. Humans are wired to resolve uncertainty, so the mind begins constructing explanations, often leaning toward personal meaning. This is how emotional storms become relational experiences rather than private ones. What starts as internal overwhelm in one person becomes an interpreted relational shift in the other, not because the intent was to involve them, but because emotional distress rarely stays fully contained when connection is close and ongoing, and the absence of clear communication turns internal struggle into shared confusion that neither side initially understands fully. The idea of a soulmate connection often intensifies emotional investment, and with that intensity comes a heightened sensitivity to even small relational shifts. When someone is deeply bonded to another person, their nervous system begins to treat that relationship as emotionally significant for safety, stability, and identity coherence. This means that any change in tone, availability, or emotional warmth is not processed as neutral information, but as something meaningful that could signal loss or disruption. The emotional stakes feel higher, so perception becomes more reactive. This amplification effect happens because attachment systems are designed to prioritize closeness and connection. When the bond feels secure, the system remains regulated. But when there is ambiguity, such as inconsistent communication or emotional withdrawal, the system shifts into monitoring mode. In that state, attention narrows toward the relationship, and the mind becomes highly attuned to cues that might indicate change. A delayed message, a shorter reply, or a different emotional tone can take on exaggerated significance, not because those cues are objectively large, but because the internal system is already activated. At the same time, the belief that someone is a soulmate can create a narrative of uniqueness and emotional irreplaceability. While this can deepen intimacy, it can also increase vulnerability to anxiety when the connection feels uncertain. The mind may unconsciously interpret emotional fluctuation as contradiction to the idea of permanence or destiny, which increases emotional reactivity. This is not a rational process. It is an attachment-driven interpretation system trying to maintain coherence in a bond that feels essential. In parallel, heightened attachment reduces tolerance for ambiguity. Where a casual connection might allow space for unanswered questions, a deeply meaningful connection often does not. The need for clarity increases, and without it, the mind fills in gaps quickly. This is where assumptions begin forming, often leaning toward fear-based interpretations because the emotional cost of potential loss feels significant. As sensitivity increases, so does emotional amplification. Small changes feel larger, neutral behaviors feel loaded, and uncertainty feels urgent. This does not necessarily reflect the actual state of the relationship, but rather the intensity of the internal attachment system responding to perceived instability in something it has labeled as highly important for emotional equilibrium. Unresolved trauma has a way of becoming active in relationships that feel emotionally significant, not because the partner is causing harm, but because closeness creates psychological safety that allows buried material to surface. Trauma is not only about past events themselves, it is also about the emotional imprint those events leave on the nervous system. When someone enters a close relationship, especially one that feels meaningful or intimate, the nervous system begins to relax its defenses slightly. That relaxation can unintentionally open access to older emotional memories, sensations, and fears that were previously suppressed in order to function day to day. This is why emotional reactions in present relationships can sometimes feel disproportionate to what is happening in the moment. A neutral comment, a delayed response, or a shift in tone may trigger a response that seems larger than the current situation warrants. What is actually being activated is not just the present interaction, but an old emotional template stored in the nervous system. The mind may not consciously connect the reaction to the past, so it experiences it as if it is entirely about the present relationship. In close bonds, this activation becomes more frequent because emotional intimacy reduces psychological distance. The closer two people become, the more opportunities there are for unconscious material to surface. This does not mean the relationship is unhealthy. It means it is emotionally engaging enough to access deeper layers of experience. However, without awareness, this can lead to confusion because reactions feel immediate and relational, even when they are partly historical in origin. Another important aspect is that unresolved trauma often carries specific emotional expectations, such as fear of abandonment, rejection, or inconsistency. When any subtle cue in the relationship resembles those old experiences, the nervous system responds as if the original threat is recurring. This can lead to heightened vigilance, emotional withdrawal, or sudden shifts in behavior that may not match the current context. The complexity lies in the overlap between past and present emotional processing. The partner experiencing activation may feel overwhelmed without fully understanding why, while the other partner experiences the outcome of that activation as relational distance or change. This creates a layered emotional experience where the present relationship becomes a canvas on which unresolved past experiences are unintentionally replayed through emotional response patterns that feel real, immediate, and difficult to separate from current reality. If this is resonating even a little, pause for a moment and ask yourself this: am I reacting to what is actually happening or to what I'm afraid it means? Because that one question can completely change how you respond next. Emotional dysregulation in one partner can subtly reshape the entire relationship dynamic because relationships are not just exchanges of words or actions, they are continuous interactions between two nervous systems that constantly influence each other. When one person struggles to regulate their emotional state, meaning they move quickly between overwhelm, withdrawal, anxiety, or irritability without being able to stabilize internally, that instability does not stay contained. It begins to shape the rhythm, tone, and emotional safety of the connection itself. In such situations, the emotionally dysregulated partner may not consistently communicate what they are experiencing. Instead, their internal turbulence shows up through inconsistent availability, shifting tone, or sudden changes in engagement. At times, they may feel close and responsive, and at other times, distant or shut down. This inconsistency creates an unpredictable emotional environment for the other person, who begins to adjust their behavior in response. Without realizing it, the relationship starts to organize itself around managing emotional volatility rather than mutual connection. The partner on the receiving end often becomes more vigilant, tracking changes in mood or communication style to anticipate shifts. This increased monitoring is not intentional control, but an adaptive response to unpredictability. Over time, this can lead to emotional fatigue because the relationship no longer feels stable or predictable. Instead of resting in connection, the mind stays alert, trying to interpret signals and prevent disconnection. Meanwhile, the dysregulated partner may also feel misunderstood or pressured because their internal experience is intense but difficult to express clearly. When they feel overwhelmed, they may withdraw to regain control, but that withdrawal can be interpreted as rejection by the other person. This creates a cycle where one person's attempt to stabilize internally triggers instability externally in the relationship. What makes this dynamic particularly complex is that neither person is necessarily acting from intent to harm or disconnect. Both are responding to internal states that are not fully regulated. However, because emotional regulation capacity differs, the relationship begins to adapt around the more unstable patterns. Over time, this can subtly shift roles, where one person becomes the emotional stabilizer and the other becomes the emotional variable, shaping how safety, closeness, and communication are experienced within the bond itself without either side consciously deciding for that structure to form in the first place. Many conflicts in close relationships feel like they are about the present situation, but a large portion of them are actually activated by older emotional experiences that are being re-evoked in the moment. This happens because the brain does not store emotional memory in a purely narrative way. It stores it in patterns of sensation, expectation, and threat response. When something in the present resembles a past emotional wound, even in a subtle way, the nervous system can respond as if the earlier experience is happening again, even though the context is different. This is why arguments often escalate beyond the original issue. A simple disagreement about timing, attention, or tone can quickly become charged with much larger emotional meaning. The present moment becomes layered with past experiences of being ignored, misunderstood, rejected, or emotionally unsafe. The reaction is no longer only about what was said or done, it becomes about what those actions represent at a deeper emotional level. The person is not just responding to the partner, but also to the emotional imprint of previous relational experiences that were never fully processed or resolved. Because these reactions are often automatic, individuals may genuinely believe they are reacting appropriately to the current situation. The emotional intensity feels justified because it is fueled by both present input and past activation. However, the partner on the receiving end experiences the reaction as disproportionate or confusing, since they are only aware of the current context and not the internal emotional history being triggered. This mismatch creates a breakdown in communication. One person is reacting to a composite emotional reality made of now plus then, while the other is responding only to now. As a result, both individuals feel misunderstood. The person experiencing activation feels unseen in their emotional pain, while the other feels unfairly blamed for something they did not intend or cause. Over time, this pattern can lead to recurring cycles where similar themes resurface in conflicts, even when the surface details change. The underlying emotional trigger remains consistent, so the argument repeatedly returns to familiar emotional ground. Without awareness of this layering effect, couples may attempt to solve the surface issue again and again without addressing the deeper emotional template driving the intensity, which keeps the conflict emotionally charged despite repeated attempts to resolve it logically or behaviorally. People often assume emotional distance always means emotional loss, but in many cases, what looks like withdrawal is actually a form of overwhelm or internal saturation. When a person becomes emotionally overloaded, their system can shift into a protective state where reducing interaction feels necessary to regain balance. This is not always a relational decision. It is often a nervous system decision. The goal is not to disconnect from the partner, but to reduce incoming emotional stimulation so internal regulation becomes possible again. In close relationships, emotional input is constant. Conversations, expectations, tone, responsiveness, and unspoken emotional exchanges all contribute to the overall load. When this accumulates beyond what a person can process at that moment, their capacity for engagement decreases. They may become quieter, less responsive, or less emotionally expressive. From the outside, this can resemble disinterest or detachment, but internally it can feel more like mental and emotional congestion where space is needed to restore clarity. The challenge arises because the other partner does not have access to this internal state. They only observe the outward behavior. Human cognition naturally tries to interpret behavior in relational terms, so emotional withdrawal is often translated into meanings about the relationship itself. This can include assumptions such as fading interest, reduced care, or emotional disengagement, even when none of those conclusions are accurate reflections of the internal experience of the withdrawing partner. Another important aspect is that overwhelm does not always look dramatic. It can be subtle and still lead to withdrawal. A person may continue functioning externally while internally feeling saturated. In such cases, stepping back emotionally is a way to prevent further escalation of internal tension. It is a regulatory strategy rather than a relational statement. However, because emotional clarity is missing in the moment, the gap between experience and interpretation widens. One person is trying to stabilize by creating space, while the other is trying to stabilize by seeking closeness or reassurance. These opposing regulation strategies can unintentionally increase tension, even though both individuals are attempting to restore emotional equilibrium in their own way. Over time, if this pattern repeats without understanding, emotional distance becomes loaded with meaning that may not reflect its actual origin. What is essentially an internal regulation process gets interpreted as relational decline, which creates unnecessary emotional distress and misunderstanding within the connection. Awareness changes emotional dynamics in relationships because it interrupts automatic reaction cycles and introduces space between stimulus and response. In emotionally charged interactions, people often operate on instinct rather than reflection. A tone shift, a delay, or a withdrawal can immediately trigger interpretation, emotion, and reaction almost simultaneously. This rapid sequence is what creates escalation, because there is no pause where meaning can be examined or alternative explanations considered. Awareness introduces that pause, allowing emotional experience to be observed rather than immediately acted upon. When someone becomes more aware of their internal processes, they begin to notice the difference between what is happening externally and what is being activated internally. For example, instead of only reacting to a partner's silence as rejection, they may also recognize the internal surge of anxiety that is being triggered. That recognition does not eliminate emotion, but it changes the relationship to it. The emotion becomes something that is experienced rather than something that dictates immediate behavior. This shift is important because most relational conflict is not created by the initial emotional trigger, but by the reaction that follows it. When reactions are automatic, they tend to amplify the situation. Questions become accusations, withdrawal becomes punishment, and reassurance seeking becomes pressure. Awareness reduces this amplification by allowing responses to be chosen rather than reflexive. Even small moments of reflection can change the trajectory of an interaction. On a deeper level, awareness also helps separate present reality from internal history. Many emotional responses in relationships are shaped by earlier experiences that are being reactivated. Without awareness, those past imprints feel like present truth. With awareness, a person can begin to recognize when their emotional intensity is larger than the current situation might reasonably explain. This recognition creates psychological distance between the feeling and the interpretation of the feeling. Awareness does not remove emotional sensitivity or make a person detached. Instead, it creates emotional clarity, where feelings are still present but no longer automatically translated into assumptions or reactive behavior. In relationships, this leads to more stable communication because each person is less likely to misinterpret temporary emotional states as permanent relational truths. Over time, awareness shifts the entire relational environment from reactive patterns to reflective ones, where emotional experiences are acknowledged in real time but do not immediately define the meaning of the connection itself, allowing space for understanding rather than escalation to guide how moments are handled together. In the end, emotional storms in relationships are rarely as simple as distance, silence, or change in behavior. What often feels like disconnection is usually a complex mix of internal overwhelm, past emotional imprints, nervous system protection, and misunderstood communication patterns unfolding at the same time. Two people can be in the same relationship and yet experience entirely different emotional realities, each responding to what they feel internally rather than what is objectively happening between them. When one person withdraws, it is not always a message of loss, and when another person reacts strongly, it is not always a sign of insecurity alone. More often, it is a reflection of how differently each nervous system processes stress, closeness, and emotional load. Without awareness, these differences can easily turn into confusion, assumptions, and cycles of misinterpretation that slowly build emotional distance even when care still exists. What changes everything is the ability to pause long enough to see beyond the immediate reaction. When emotional responses are observed rather than immediately acted upon, space opens up for understanding instead of escalation. In that space, assumptions soften, interpretations become more flexible, and communication becomes less about defending emotional positions and more about understanding internal experiences. Relationships do not become stable because there is never distress. They become more stable when distress is no longer automatically translated into fear-based conclusions. Emotional storms are not always signs of ending. Often they are signs of internal overload seeking regulation. When both people begin to recognize this, the relationship shifts from reactive survival patterns into more conscious connection. Ultimately, awareness does not eliminate emotional intensity, but it changes how that intensity is handled. And in that shift, relationships gain something far more important than constant calm: the ability to stay connected even when emotions are not.